Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. I want to welcome y'all to this brief introductory video of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, this is the first in a long series of videos that we're going to be covering this really interesting topic. We're going to be taking a look at cool weapons and accoutrements related to them, and of course, related to the Mosin Nagant as well. But before we do that, I want to give a little bit of good background to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because if there's one thing out of many, I must admit, that modern American public schools have failed us with, it's teaching us about the quirkiness and the importance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because I think a lot of folks are just not that familiar with them, especially here in America. We tend to just sort of brush it off because we just don't know that much about it, and we just got other things to deal with. However, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a little bit more appreciation, or at least a little bit more understanding of the quirkiness and why it's actually such an interesting topic. So where do we start? Well, we need to go back in time a little bit to Austria, what we would consider Austria. Now, it's sort of confusing because we go from Austria to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then sort of back to Austria again, kind of what we have today. But we go all the way back to before the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You also have Austria, which encompassed a very large landmass in Europe. In fact, it was really only second to Russia in landmass, and this would have been about around the second half of the 19th century. We're going to be starting today around the year 1848, and this was not a great year for the monarchs of Europe, because there were a whole series of revolutions sweeping the continent in that year. And a lot of them are just, had to do with civic unrest, people wanting more rights, wanting more liberal forms of government, etc. You've kind of heard the whole spiel before. It's happened a whole bunch of times. And really it was no different in the case of Austria, and of course the ruling Habsburgs, who have been in power since the 13th century, which is quite a long time. They were in power for around 600 years, if you could believe that. Unfortunately, though, around the year 1848 almost saw the total upheaval of the Habsburgs, because there was this thing called the Hungarian Revolution. And you see, Austria, around 1848, remember I said it covered this massive landmass in Europe. That includes a lot of modern-day countries in Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, parts of the Ukraine, parts of Lithuania, parts of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, even parts of Italy, going down even more to the Balkans, and even parts of Romania. You can kind of see how there's a lot of different things going on there, and a lot of those folks around this time were all sort of interested in having their own independence, and had been for a while, and continued in the future. The Hungarian Revolution, though, was a bit different, because it actually posed such a large threat to the Habsburgs that they actually probably would have ended up getting overthrown by the Hungarians in 1848 had it not been for the Russians that actually came to the aid of the Habsburgs and actually marched their army into Hungary and crushed the revolution. You might say that Austria owed them one after that. We'll get back to that in a little bit, though. So, okay, they quelled that, but it was pretty obvious that really this whole kingdom / empire, whatever you want to call it, was hanging on by a thread. And so there was a series of reforms that were made later on, and eventually this sort of led to what we consider the compromise and the formation of a dual monarchy-ish, kind of, except it was sort of the same person. This gets really weird. So Austria and Hungary ended up having their own separate governments, except for the fact that you had Franz Joseph, who was and really became the emperor of Austria, but he also acted as the king of Hungary. So he's emperor and a king at the same time of two different countries, and they're kind of the same, but they're also different. They have their own governments, except they have one common, I guess, foreign goal and one common military, sort of. They would share the same military. Really complicated. And when you start digging into the details, it only gets a lot more complicated, especially when you consider the fact that you have all these other ethnicities like the Czechs and the Poles and various other ones that all sort of don't really want to be a part of this whole thing with the Habsburgs. It also gets a little bit more complicated when we consider the fact that all of these different folks spoke different languages under one empire kingdom thing. So you had the Austrians, right, and they spoke German, and this would have been looked on as the primary, or at least the most important language from many aspects in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But you also have, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Italian, Croatian. I could keep on going down the list because it doesn't stop anytime soon. So this is going to come back to bite them when we get to World War I. But for now, it's sort of hanging on by a thread. But with this compromise, maybe they got another thread to hang on by. So maybe now they're hanging on by 2 threads. Well, they then tried their hand at some military conquests, and that didn't really go so well either. They ended up losing the territory of Lombardy over in modern-day Italy, which is sort of like the area Milan is in, which was actually their richest province in the whole empire. And then their banking system pretty much collapsed. And then a while later, they decided to go to war with the Germans, in which, really, I guess the Prussians, however you want to look at it. And they were totally crushed because in 1866, the Prussians had the infamous Dreisen needle rifle, and the Austrians still had those pesky Lorenz muskets. And, well, apart from all the other problems in their military and disorganization and logistics, it was not good. And so really the only thing that resulted there was the total unification of Germany. And Austria didn't really look that good, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, excuse me, didn't really look that good either. But a little bit before that, we'll backtrack a little bit. In the 1850s, we had actually the Crimean War, which we've also talked about before. And this was primarily Russia's conflict with some various factions, including the Ottoman Empire. And one of the problems was, remember back in the Hungarian Revolution in 1848, Russia pretty much saved the Archduke and the whole empire and the whole Habsburg dynasty. They owed Russia something big. And in the Crimean War, Russia sort of expected the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarians, to have their back, help us out a little bit here. And they were sort of like, nah, man, we're good, we ain't gonna help you none. And so this really took a sour turn in the foreign relations between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. And after that, it just sort of kept going downhill. It was not good. To further compound that, going forward a couple decades into the 1870s with the Russo-Turkish War, now Russia won that, but in the aftermath, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended up occupying the provinces of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Russians really, really didn't like that either, because they sort of saw that as them sort of trying to intervene and encroach on Russia's own interest in the Balkan region. And then it got worse in 1908 when the Austro-Hungarian Empire formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this sort of led into a whole mess where we have, of course, the Balkan Wars. There's actually 2 of them, which then, of course, led to World War I. Now, World War I is, of course, what we're going to really be focusing here on in this series. But how did we actually get to World War I? Now, this is an important thing because the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, sort of was paying a visit to the area in the Balkans to sort of establish their dominance in that region. And the only thing that accomplished was him getting shot by basically someone who was pro-Serb. Technically, Gavrilo Princip, technically he was a Serb. And, a lot of people still debate today, how much the Serbian government itself, or Serbia as a whole, depending on how you want to look at it, played in that assassination, or if it was really just, one or a few guys actually behind it all. It's still debated today, but either way, it wasn't good. And the other thing you have to understand is, one of the big pitfalls the Austro-Hungarian Empire had was there's really no unity. They had a lot of diversity, but it certainly wasn't their strength. And one of the problems was that the German speakers, a lot of them really didn't like Slavs at all, which is a problem because in a lot of ways, the majority of their country was comprised of Slavs. Yeah, as you can imagine, that didn't go so well for them. So you sort of have this irony where in World War I, you have all of these factions expected to help you, or these peoples expected to help you fight for the empire, and sometimes that didn't always go as expected. And in fact, during World War I, we had a lot of cases, especially in 1915, where you had a lot of Czech mutinies, because the Austro-Hungarians didn't really treat the Czechs within their own ranks very well at all. And since the Russians, who they were technically fighting against, were fellow Slavs, it ended up being that there was a lot of mutinies over to that side. Now, it's a little bit more complicated, and sometimes it's a bit more exaggerated of what actually happened than the truth, but you can kind of see how this is just a big mess. On top of all of this, we also have another problem with officers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I. Now, this gets worse. Remember, going back to the language problem, the officers, about 80% of them spoke German, but only about like 30-ish% of the actual troops spoke German. And so basically what would happen is the actual troops, like if you were in the army, you were expected to know approximately 80 different words in German. And these would be various commands like, halt, fire, march, things like that. So that was sort of like the universal basic set of commands. Like if you're going to be in the army, you at least got to know those. All right. Well, the officers, however, the men under their command, the officers actually had to know the language of the men under their command. So you had cases where you had an Austro-Hungarian officer that had to speak Italian because the troops under his command all spoke Italian. That got complicated because, as you can imagine, then you have to sign, okay, we can't just send this officer here and this officer there. We need an officer that speaks Italian here and one here, and then we need one that speaks Hungarian, and then we need another one that speaks Croatian here. And this is sort of going all over the place, and it's not good. And especially it gets like exponentially worse when you consider that they lost probably the majority of their officers within the first year of the Great War. And so, as you can imagine, this led to a lot of issues with pretty much every aspect of their entire army, because you're struggling to even have officers to command your men because you can't find someone that even speaks their own language, because you got like 14 or 15 different languages that you have to deal with. So the moral of the story with the Austro-Hungarian Empire is that it's really complicated, but it's super quirky and it's super interesting. Some of the weapons and tactics and stuff that they're using is just really quirky by today's standards, and just honestly really cool. And this is just sort of this interesting bygone era that just doesn't exist anymore. And so it's really cool to go back and look at pictures and weapons from that time frame. And especially when we start dealing with stuff related to Mosins, we're going to get into some really weird stuff. So buckle up, guys. I hope you're really excited, because we got some really cool stuff we're going to start taking a look at. In our next video, the first thing we're going to be taking a look at is actually going to be a black powder rifle. And it may or may not be Russian, and we haven't looked at one here on the channel before, and we're going to be doing a much more in-depth video on it in the future, but I wanted to take a look at it specifically because I think it's a good place to start out in regards to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it's also going to help highlight a lot of pitfalls and honestly just a lot of desperation at the time. So I hope you guys get a kick out of that. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let me know if you guys have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.